Started. All right, here we go. Not just an indigenous problem. While indigenous people are framed as the old age, quote, indigenous problem, decolonization and land back aren't just an indigenous problem. If every struggle were made into a climate struggle, which must be done if we are to have a future on this planet, then every struggle in North America must be made into a struggle up for decolonization. The solution offered in the Red Deal must entail a revolution that turns back the forces of destruction. It must penetrate the economic and cultural realms with equal urgency and force. Indigenous peoples should be empowered to develop and implement restorative practices according to their own customs and traditions. Caretakers should not hesitate to take the reins of leadership. The energies and passions of indigenous people at the forefront of resistant extractive capitalism should inspire everyone, as water protectors and land defenders have inspired a generation of climate justice revolutionaries. Indigenous demands for the restoration of land, air, and water are essential for return of the collective humanity. This is a vision and a mandate of the Red Deal, uniting indigenous and non-indigenous people in a common struggle to save the earth. Indigenous political structures and economic systems do not apply only to indigenous people. Our liberation is bound to the liberation of all humans on and the planet. What we seek is a world premised on indigenous values of introspecies, responsibility, and balance. We seek to uplift technologies, governance structures, and economic strategies that will make this value possible in the immediate future and in the long term, and which always have the future health of the land that at the center of their design and implementations, indigenous or not. In this sense, decolonization is for the benefit and benefits everyone. It also needs our collective cooperation to succeed. The 4 principles. The following is a plan of collective climate actions based on the principles that we developed after intensive conversations, dialogue, and feedback from indigenous and non-indigenous community members, comrades, relatives, and fellow travelers. The first Red Deal Coalition meeting was held on June 19th, 2019 at Larry Cause Freedom Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Since then, the platform has been revised and adopted by social movements, politicians, and organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America. This book is an extension of these original principles and a reflection on the changing material conditions we confront and how these conditions shape and inspire the vision we set forth in the original document. The Red Deal is a living document. Not just an indigenous problem. While indigenous people are framed as the old age, quote, indigenous problem, decolonization and land back aren't just an indigenous problem. If every struggle were made into a climate struggle, which must be done if we are to have a future on this planet, then every struggle in North America must be made into a struggle up for decolonization. The solution offered in the Red Deal must entail a revolution that turns back the forces of destruction. It must penetrate the economic and cultural realms with equal urgency and force. Indigenous peoples should be empowered to develop and implement restorative practices according to their own customs and traditions. Caretakers should not hesitate to take the reins of leadership. The energies and passions of indigenous people at the forefront of resistant extractive capitalism should inspire everyone, as water protectors and land defenders have inspired a generation of climate justice revolutionaries. Indigenous demands for the restoration of land, air, and water are essential for return of the collective humanity. This is a vision and a mandate of the Red Deal, uniting indigenous and non-indigenous people in a common struggle to save the earth. Indigenous political structures and economic systems do not apply only to indigenous people. Our liberation is bound to the liberation of all humans on and the planet. What we seek is a world premised on indigenous values of introspecies, responsibility, and balance. We seek to uplift technologies, governance structures, and economic strategies that will make this value possible in the immediate future and in the long term, and which always have the future health of the land that at the center of their design and implementations, indigenous or not. In this sense, decolonization is for the benefit and benefits everyone. It also needs our collective cooperation to succeed. The 4 principles. The following is a plan of collective climate actions based on the principles that we developed after intensive conversations, dialogue, and feedback from indigenous and non-indigenous community members, comrades, relatives, and fellow travelers. The first Red Deal Coalition meeting was held on June 19th, 2019 at Larry Cause Freedom Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Since then, the platform has been revised and adopted by social movements, politicians, and organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America. This book is an extension of these original principles and a reflection on the changing material conditions we confront and how these conditions shape and inspire the vision we set forth in the original document. The Red Deal is a living document in the sense that it should not be taken as gospel, nor as an idealistic or utopian program for change.
As conditions shift, so must we. We must be both optimistic and action-oriented, permanent builders. A great deal has changed since we came together in the spring of 2019 to begin our initial discussions about what would later become the Red Deal. The ideas, principles, and plans of action contained within this book have therefore been forged through movement, struggle, and direct action. Some of them have already been tested and revised, awaiting new tests and new potential revisions by those who are moved to take it up within their own struggles and movements. While there is an inherent flexibility built into the Red Deal, we remain steadfast in the following 4 methods and principles of organizing that anchor the original pamphlet. We encourage you to act upon what you find in the Red Deal by applying these principles to your local, tribal, or regional situation. Number 1, what creates crisis cannot solve it. Divestment was a popular strategy during the No DAPL, NODAPL, uprising in 2016. Water protectors called upon the masses to divest from the financial institutions subsidizing the pipeline. The Red Deal continues this call for divestment from fossil fuel industries. But we go one step further. We draw from Black abolitionist traditions to call for divestment from carceral institutions like police, prisons, the military, and border imperialism, in addition to divest from fossil fuels. Divestment is only half of the equation. What will we do with the resources that will become available once we divest from these institutions and practices? As of 2015, military spending accounted for upwards of 54% of all discretionary spending at the federal level. Proposed discretionary spending for national security in 2020 comes in at $750 billion, with $718.3 billion slated specifically for the U.S. military. In a given year, the U.S. provides $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel. 180, a lot more than that recently. $182 billion is spent each year on cops and prisons. These figures don't even include revenues from the fossil fuel industry. Compare this to the $68 billion allocated for education in 2016 and the $186 billion allocated for mental health services in 2014. $66 billion of discretionary funding is spent on healthcare each year, with only $5.4 billion allocated to Indigenous Health Service, IHS, the branch of the Department of Health and Human Services responsible for providing direct medical and public health services to members of federally recognized tribes.
Despite treaty and federal obligations to provide adequate health care, Native people, especially those living in urban locations, have the worst health care in the nation. Almost half of Americans cannot afford basic procedures, and pharmaceutical corporations control these already deficient public services through lobbying. The U.S. government is threatening to further cut spendings on education, healthcare, food stamps, and other critical health and human services in order to inflate military spending, bail out banks, and subsidize fossil fuel corporations. Meanwhile, schools, nursing homes, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, soup kitchens, art programs, museums, clinics, public bus lines, community farms, and local businesses are having to raise money through GoFundMe campaigns and bake sales to remain in operation. Imagine if the U.S. military had to hold a bake sale to keep its doors open while life-giving and sustaining programs were fully funded and never in fear of disappearing. Imagine if we had over $1 trillion to invest in healthcare for everyone, to increase teachers' wages so they can provide quality free education to everyone, to repair roads and provide safe and accessible public transportation for workers, to provide safe and comfortable homes for elders, and to fund large-scale language revitalization programs in every indigenous nation in the continent. While ludicrous under our current system, there is not, as the ruling class wants us to believe, a scarcity of resources. There are plenty of resources to fund these programs and restore dignity to our relatives. We must simply wrest them from the greedy clutches of the ruling class and distribute them to the people. 2, changing from below and to the left.
Anti-protest laws have been considered in dozens of states in the wake of Black Lives Matter and No DAPL. At the same time, politicians continue to withdraw from social justice demands for healthcare, housing, and education in the GND, choosing to focus on reforms limited to climate change only. It is important to remember that the GND was possible only because its main proponent, AOC, became politicized by the No DAPL uprising. Indigenous people are and have always been at the forefront of the struggle for climate justice. We will not back down from the GND's demands for a dignified life, nor will we back down from centering the leadership of Indigenous people in this fight. In fact, we must go further. We must throw the full weight of people power behind these demands for a dignified life. People power is the organized force of the masses, a movement to reclaim our humanity and rightful relations with the earth. People power will not only topple empire, but it will build a new world from the ashes, a world where many worlds fit. There can be no rich people without poor people. The rich depend upon the poor. But the poor don't need the rich. We only need each other. This is the power of the masses. Although Indigenous people live in a capitalist society, we continue to practice people power. Pueblo communities feed friends and relatives on many ceremonial occasions throughout the year. The original purpose of this was to prize surplus from those who held more wealth and redistribute it amongst those who didn't, so that neither a poor class nor a ruling class could form. Everyone's material needs were met. There was no starvation, no homelessness, no alienation. Everyone was a relative, and everyone had relatives. Capitalism destroyed this world. We must destroy capitalism to bring it back. People power is the most direct form of democracy. Every day, people decide what's best for themselves, not the elite and powerful. The wealthiest in the world have refused to pay taxes for more than a century, while Indigenous people starve and die of preventable diseases. We are of the conviction that crying on the shoulder of the man who stole your land is the opposite of people power. You can't smudge the purposeful unaliving out of capitalism, nor can you expect the powerful to give up their wealth out of the kindness of their hearts. So how do we get things to change? Lobby Congress and politicians? No. We need to reach out directly to our people, hitting the streets and galvanizing the support of poor and working class communities.
Once community support is galvanized, politicians will follow. Even if they don't, we will continue to organize and build power from below that cannot be ignored or crushed. Our leverage is people. Leverage comes from the movement behind you. The power comes from reclaiming your rightful path towards equal development. Only when people move, do we build enough power to force concession and eventually win. 3, politicians can't do what only the mass movements do. Politicians use the term, quote, reform as a catch-all for their plans for social change. Reform typically means asking the power to implement gradual changes that we hope will eventually improve our lives. This approach attempts to treat the symptoms of crisis rather than the structures of power that creates crisis in the first place. For example, in March 2016, white police officer Austin Shapley murdered 27-year-old Navajo mother Loreen, Tenzing Tsingine, in broad daylight in Winslow, Arizona. The murderer was captured on his mandatory lapel camera, a result of police reforms. Lapel cameras are often cited by police reformers as a necessary deterrent to police violence and killing. Yet, Shapley murdered Tenzingen. I can't say.
L'Oreal.
Huh?
Her first name was L'Oreal.
But they don't say that there. They said, yet Shapley murdered their last name with impunity and faced no charges. The same year, I wonder if the T is silent. Singine? Tenzing? I can't say it. Was murdered. Police arrest over 800 water protectors and brutalized and traumatized countless other at Standing Rock. That year, police killed Native people at higher rates than other groups. They killed Native women at 6 times, and killed Native women at 6 times the rate of white women. Yet, when proponents call for reform for missing and murdered indigenous women and girls and two-spirits, MMIWGTS, the solution is often more police. In 2018 and 2019, we saw an increase of deaths of indigenous children in migrant detention centers along the U.S.-Mexico border. We witnessed the shootings by U.S. Border Patrol of Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez. It's Gonzalez, an indigenous woman from Guatemala. And we mourn the death of indigenous trans women, Roxanne Hernandez, in the detention facility operated by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Immigration reforms have called for border patrols to keep families together and have also filed lawsuits to call for the construction of, quote, more humane cages for their families and individuals.
The question these reformers ask is, how can we improve the police? Who do we need to lobby to make these improvements? Instead, we ask, why do we need police? Why do we need borders? Chinga la migra, abolish ICE, and no ban on stolen land are not mere slogans, but demands for a dignified life. The police, military, and border patrol exist to protect the interests and wealth of the elite. Instead of providing life-saving housing, healthcare, and food, reforms give us more cops, more soldiers, and more cages. States protect capital and its caretakers, the ruling class. They do not protect the people. Reformists who appeal to the state for change compromise our future by aligning with the interests of the ruling class. We refuse to compromise. But we do believe in reform, just a different kind, a non-reformist reform that doesn't limit the possibility of what the status quo offers, but which fundamentally challenges the existing structure of power by prioritizing, organizing, and elevating the needs and demands of the masses. If we don't want to improve the system by implementing policies from the top down, we want to destroy it, either by fire or a million small cuts in order to replace it. Our philosophy of reform is thus to creation of social wealth means the empowerment of those who have been dispossessed. Social wealth can be restored by building a mass movement that has the power and leverage to reclaim resources from the ruling class and redistribute them to the dispossessed. 4. From theory to action. From the White House to CEOs of multinational corporations, bosses run the world and plunder without challenge. Given the staggering amount of destruction and unalive just a few individuals inflict on billions, it is strange that no unified left has emerged in the global north to pose a real threat to the bosses. We have witnessed in the last handful of years massive grassroots rebellions against the fossil fuel industry, police violence, racist immigration policies, and labor exploitation. Yet nothing has coalesced into a unified mass movement.
We believe that the struggling for non-reformist reforms to restore the health of our bodies and the earth will serve as a most powerful vehicle for building mass movement fast that can take on the bosses. We cannot simply be against something, we must be for something. We will construct our own policies out of the grassroots actions that seek to caretake and support one another. Through organizing all around non-reformist reforms for housing, food security and sovereignty, domestic and gender violence justice, suicide prevention, land restoration, and more, we can and will build infrastructures of liberation. As the Black Panther Party decided at a certain juncture in its history, the Red Nation realized we must undertake realistic and principled actions now that will help build our cumulative capacity for revolution in the future. We must not turn away from the truth. We do not yet possess the capacity for revolution. Otherwise, we would have seen an unified mass movement come out of the remarkable revolutionary energy of the past decade. And yet, we have very little time to get there. This is the contradiction and the duty of our generation: decolonization or extinction. While the idealism of the left is a stunning beacon for the world we seek to live in, ideas alone will not save us. As we say in our principles of unity, quote, we can die having had a, quote, correct position, end quote, within the quotes, but having accomplished nothing and freed no one, end quote. We must build the world we seek through building power. We build power by building movements, and we build movements through coming together with other working class people. Correct ideas and theories of change that are worthy of reproduction only matter if they arise from and directly nourish our collective movements. We must build our people's confidence to theorize and respond to material conditions, assess the tools and the means of struggle available to us, and act upon this knowledge. We worry that what is currently on offer from the left, however important and well-intended, is not enough. We cannot simply heal our individual trauma, nor can we consume better to save the environment. We cannot vote harder, nor can we place all our hope in the few individuals in Congress. We cannot bounce from insurrection to insurrection, nor can we continue to funnel our energies into nonprofit organization. We cannot build isolated utopias while the rest of the world burns, nor can we spend our time debating one another online.
Climate change will unalive us before any of these actions liberate the planet from capitalism, let alone improve our lives enough to wage a successful revolution. Liberation isn't a theory, it's a necessity and a right that belongs to the humble people of the earth. How will we make it happen? We will not turn away from opportunities to organize, agitate, and build people power in spaces of state surveillance like prisons, child services, hospitals, and classrooms that are designed to dehumanize and disempower the people. The state sets its targets on poor and working class people because it knows they pose the greatest threat to its existence. We will not let the state steal our relatives or gut our power any longer. We must swarm the state, inside and out, multiplying the threat by millions until it crumbles. Indigenous people know that every moment of our existence is mediated by the state. It is fundamentally violent and rigged in favor of murderous elites. We have no wish to reform or perfect it, but we refuse to relinquish the power of state institutions, the sheer resources available to humanity, to the ruling class. To do so means we cede key terrain to fascists who set fire to our future and reformers who water down our demands and unalive us by a million small cuts. We must wield people power. We must wield people power in all arenas to build our movement. We must create the conditions for liberation by any means necessary. We will not be fooled by reformist doublespeak, nor will we relent in our plans for liberation. Whatever strategy we choose, we will operate from a position of strength that holds the abolition of capitalism and total liberation as its uncompromising core. Our non-reformist reforms will come in many forms. They will look like grassroots indigenous seed bank networks where thousands of sustainable farmers share, trade, and feed their communities. They will look like successful runs for city council elections where left candidates implement a people's platform for climate and social justice at city and municipal levels. They will look like land back camps or tribal council resolutions that reject colonial water settlements by banding with other indigenous nations to blockade all government and corporate efforts to commodify water. Whatever form they take, we must simply get to work. This book comprises 3 areas of struggle: divest, heal our bodies, heal our planet, and a conclusion. In each area, we discuss critical caretaking concerns.
It is not enough to simply provide criticism. Radical critique must caretake the collective relations of liberation to actualize it. The first section calls for ending occupation and draws inspiration from the history of Black liberation struggles and the platform of the movement for Black lives that calls for the abolition of and divestment from the prison industrial complex. We also connect with struggles against militarization and colonial occupation. The second section elaborates how the reinvestment strategy should center around common humanity and social justice approach. Divestment from occupation and prison requires a reinvestment of collective practices for healing our bodies. The third section advocates for a reinvestment strategy in a common future for the entire planet. The massive amounts of resources dedicated to the military and prison industrial complex should be reinvested and reallocated towards paying climate debt to the rest of the world and to helping to heal the ravages of capitalism and imperialism. The conclusion is to call to action to step into a strong current of history that is the tradition of indigenous resistance. Divestment, Part 1. End the occupation. Capitalism requires a powerful military industry for its process of accumulation and composition of control over territories.
Go ahead.
Introduction. The occupation of the indigenous land of settler colonialism has yet to end. Despite historical narratives of progress in the United States, let me see here. Colonization is not a thing of the past. It is what shapes our present. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes in An Indigenous People's History of the United States, quote, "To say that the United States is a colonialist settler state is not to make an accusation, but rather to face historical reality, without which consideration not much of U.S. history makes sense, unless indigenous peoples are erased. End quote. The settler colonialism is an ongoing project of erasure of indigenous peoples in order to replace them with settlers who claim to own and dominate the land. The occupation of this land has always been maintained by violence or by threat of violence. The U.S. invests billions of dollars in its tools for occupation. The military uses to enforce its global domination and steal natural resources from the global south. The police it empowers to repress domestic resistance to occupation. The prison it funds to warehouse and punish those who do not adhere to settler capitalist social norms. These three institutions have coalesced into the Military and Prison Industrial Complex, MPIC, an occupying force of stolen land that operates by reinforcing settler dominance, white supremacy, and global imperialism. The Military and Prison Industrial Complex refers to the consideration of government spending.
Try again.
Concentration of government spending to private interests for some perceived social good that in reality supports corrupt industries. The military industrial complex takes public money to make war profiteers rich, and those private corporations are rewarded lucrative government contracts to develop expensive technologies of destruction at the public expenses. Similarly, mass incarceration has risen in the United States, with support of both the Republicans and Democratic parties to create jobs in devastated rural economies and move undesired population out of the cities. It serves as a population release valve for contradictions of capitalism. Increasingly, private prisons are making money on incarceration of Black, brown, and indigenous peoples. To date, the United States prisons more people than any other country in the world.
With funds, equipment, and training from the federal government, police across the U.S. employ armored vehicles. I'm going to read that again. With funds, equipment, and training from the federal government, police across the U.S. employ armored vehicles, chemical weapons, and military tactics of counterinsurgency to suppress protests. First Amendment rights, right? They have exported these tactics, many of which they learned in the genocidal indigenous wars of the 19th century, to militarize and police forces of oppressive regimes across the world. Equally concerning, U.S. police and military personnel have been trained by Israeli occupation forces in the most modern techniques and technologies of settler colonialism. On top of this international state violence, oppressed people in the United States face vigilante violence from settlers intent on defending white supremacy along the southern border, in towns surrounding indigenous nations, and in cities across the country. As we have seen recently with the Black Lives Matter uprisings, the police and military are deeply entwined with white supremacist militias, far-right groups, and fascist formations. The U.S. MPIC is the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet. Given the immense power and resources that support the settler occupation of indigenous land and global imperialism, we must find effective ways to diminish and defund these institutions without confronting the structures that unalive, displace, imprison, and oppress us. We will not be able to create alternative ways of being, as these will be swiftly targeted and crushed as threats to the existing status quo. Divestment is a strategy for dismissing these structures. At its most basic, divestment is the removal of funds, resources, and energy from what harms us. It has a long history and powerful movements against injustice, including the global movement to end apartheid in South Africa, the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement to end Israel's occupation of Palestine, and the fossil fuel divestment delegations indigenous women led as part of the No DAPL movement in 2016. The U.S. Border Patrol employs Israeli technology developed for the walls of Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. police departments send officers to learn tactics of repression from Israeli occupation forces. The exchange of technologies of violence must be stopped for ourselves and for our Palestinian relatives. We have identified 5 areas of struggle within the larger MPIC as priorities for large-scale, targeted divestment campaigns.
Now, the MPIC is the Military Prison Industrial Complex, just for everybody to do that. Area 1. Defund police, immigration and customs enforcement, customs and border protection, and child protective services. The first area of struggle we see in ending the occupation is defunding the occupational forces that oppress us. The U.S. invests immense resources in policing its subjects, patrolling its borders, and enforcing colonial domination in order to maintain settler control over these lands it occupies, rather than addressing the structural causes of poverty, displacement, and colonization. The state criminalizes indigenous and other colonized people. The police in particular have historically brutalized, oppressed communities and operate as an occupying force in poor communities. These serve the interests of the settler ruling class by protecting private property, evicting people from their homes, and, as we have seen with the vigorous uprising in the history of the U.S., crushing any resistance of colonial occupation and racism. Today's police, we are well versed in military tactics and counterinsurgencies, which they employ on water protectors, land defenders, protesters against the murder of unarmed black people, and anyone who defies the ruling class. Xenophobia against people of color is the staple of white supremacy in the United States. Since the creation of the Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, in 2003, in the wake of 9/11, the police have increased cooperations with federal agents to capture, incarcerate, and deport migrants from Asia, Africa, Latin America. The CPB and ICE were created out of the Patriot Act as part of the quote-unquote war on terror. This war targeted Muslims in the United States and abroad. The reforms gave ICE agents unprecedented powers to harass U.S. citizens, often people of color, traveling on public transit. Agents have carried out many murders, sexual assaults, citizens abroad without due process. Obama earned the name deporter-in-chief, quote-unquote, for ramping up immigrant deportations. In 2016, Trump expanded on the Obama's deportation infrastructure and began a policy of family separation that imprisoned migrant children and parents in detention centers and in county jails.
An example of state violence is Child Protective Services and its removal of Indigenous children from their families and tribes. Throughout the long and ongoing history of Indigenous genocide, one of the tactics of settler society is the removal of Indigenous children. From the late 19th century until as recently as 1973, Native children were taken away. That's BS. As recently as now, Native children are taken away to boarding schools to be stripped of their identity and assimilated into settler society, which falls under the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, quote, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Today, Native children are taken away by Child Protective Services at disproportionate rates, and families are separated due to poverty and criminalization. Since 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, gave tribes some protections, and I believe ICWA's back, gave tribes some protections from child removal by requiring that Native children removed from their families be placed with other family members, a family within their tribe, or an Indigenous family of another tribe before being adopted by white families. However, the ICWA has come under legal attack as recently as, I think this year. In 2013, in Adoptive Couple versus Baby Girl, the U.S. Supreme Court started to whittle away at the protections in the law, denying a Cherokee father custody of a child his white wife put up for adoption after separating from the father. Altogether, the police, immigration agencies, and child protective services use immense resources to discipline, exclude, and disrupt Indigenous people, along with everyone targeted by state violence. We seek to defund these institutions first. Ending the occupation means taking away the power of the state to oppress us. There are many ongoing campaigns to defund municipal police so that cities can spend their money on other projects that will actually benefit the masses, and we encourage you to join them. With the 2020 uprisings against police unalivings, calls for disbanding and abolishing police, ICE, and CBP have coalesced into a coordinated movement led by Black and Indigenous organizations, trans rights and feminist groups, and advocates for incarcerated people. Support your local Black Lives Matter organization. Well, that depends. And the many others who are actively organizing campaigns, yes, to reallocate funds. Check if your city has a campaign to stop the deadly exchange or start one yourself.
Coinciding with the struggle of materially weakening police departments, we must also work to fight the glorification of police benevolence and the idea that, quote, blue lives matters more than others. We must refuse the co-optation of our movements through reformist calls for community control over diversity hiring of police officers. Since the civil rights movement, the police have recruited from minority communities to induce us to brutalize our own people. Yet we have seen no material improvement of our treatment by police. This speaks to the trap of seeking representation within oppressive systems. Having cops who look like us will not change the underlying relationship of violence that maintain the status quo. This is partly due to the power of the police unions, which serve to shield police officers from accountability and which do not, like labor unions, serve the needs of workers. Instead, police unions protect the violent defenders of private property and white supremacy. We must also turn our attention to the violence that is occurring along the US-Mexico border, both in the deserts where the agents and vigilantes chase and murder asylum seekers, and in the detention centers, imprisoning these fleeing violence and economic despairs. We urge you to join efforts to close the detention centers, to release all migrants, and reunification of families. If you are able, you can organize your communities into networks of supporting for immigrants and asylum seekers and provide material support, shelters, legal representation, and deportation defense. We must fight for the freedom of all migrants without exceptions, or, quote, good immigrants, end quote. Narratives that would exclude some of the ultimately justify the criminalization of all. The police and border patrol tactics and technologies we are facing here are very much connected to global patterns of war, occupation, and border enforcement. We draw our attention to the collaboration between U.S. police agencies and the Israeli occupation forces that displace, harass, and murder Palestinians in their homelands. Ultimately, we must take our communities' safety into our own hands, since we know that the settler state will not protect us and will only harm us in its efforts to maintain dominance. We have seen a rise of community self-defense, such as that of the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, and the indigenous communities that have faced off with the Klan and colonial military in the US and in Canada. One tactic that we have seen used successfully is what is known as, quote, cop watch, end quote, where community members observe and record interactions between police and people in their neighborhood.
This will be my last time I read. It is legal to film police in most cities as long as you are in a public space and maintain enough distance. In fact, many of the cases of police brutality that have sparked the global Black Lives Matter movement and recent calls for police abolition did so because they were recorded. While many people film arrests and other interactions with police, it is important to focus cop watching on the police themselves, and care should be taken to not endanger or incriminate the targets of police harassment. For this reason, it is often paired with Know Your Rights training and pamphlets that can be given to community members who witness the arrests and harassment by police, explaining to them why you are filming the police and how they can protect their community from police brutality. Finally, the police cannot be the solution to the problems our communities face. Taking inspiration from the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit MMIWG2S movement, which demands the investigation and prevention of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people, we must not rely on the police. Rather than relying on police and increasing their funding and power to investigate crimes against Indigenous people that the police themselves often commit, we should organize community defense initiatives against violence. Part of the problem of protecting ourselves from settler state violence is that many Native people find themselves away from their communities or in border towns where tribes have little to no jurisdiction or power. Area 2. End border town violence. Border towns emerged from the dispossession checkpoints. They are also found within the settler nation itself, at the boundaries between indigenous and settler communities. Border towns are those that surround indigenous nations, often with significant populations of Native people, yet they are typically marked and policed as white spaces. in the same sense that suburbs were originally, and still are, perceived as spaces for whiteness.
Let's give the only thing I can give. That's all I can give. All right. The function of the border town is to exploit the identity, labor, and death of indigenous people. Indeed, often a border town's economy relies on native workers and white terrorism to museums and stores that contain our art, ceremonial objects, and even the remains of our ancestors. On the one hand, settler occupation is always built on the indigenous death, and on the other, border town trades in the narrative of an indigenous, quote, past for tourism. Sorry, it wasn't terrorism, it's tourism. Sorry. Territories held by indigenous nations can, under settler control during the several centuries of European settlement and westward expansion through wars, massacres, treaty negotiations, and privatization, followed by forced selling, all of which forced indigenous people off their homelands and into reservations. The Homestead Act of 1862 and Dawes, I think it's D-A-W-E-S, Dawes Act of 1887 served to divide entire nations into individual landholdings that compelled this threat, with threats of violence and increased dependency on the European capitalist economy, could be transferred to private settler ownership. Many indigenous people were forced to sell their parcels of land in order to settle debts, pay taxes, and feed themselves and their families. The Homestead Act gave large tracts of these lands, as well as those recently secured by U.S. Army violence, to white settlers for very cheap, and was repealed only in 1975. After transferring millions of acres of land to white settlers, as indigenous nations become dislocated from their lands and forms of subsistence, they increasingly become forced into wage labor for the very settlers who stole their land. They also were forced to rely on nearby trading posts and mercantile stores to exchange rug weavings, pottery, and wool for everyday necessities. Settlers, on the other hand, were largely dependent on indigenous labor in the early years of westward expansion, and to this day, border towns rely on indigenous people to work shops and create products to sell in stores or markets that profit off of native art and culture. Many of these lenders, pawn shops, and trading posts offer indigenous people a small profit for family heirlooms or artwork, while selling these items at a higher price to white collectors, museums, and wealthy individuals. Car dealerships, payday lenders, and other preparatory businesses prey on indigenous people on and off reservations by locking them in an endless cycle of debt. This relationship of capitalist exploitation in the border towns continues the long history of colonial extraction from indigenous peoples, lands, and labor. These border towns, like those along the southern border, are locations of extreme levels of surveillance, policing, and violence in order to contain the threats, quote unquote, of indigenous existence that contradicts the myth of settler society. The continuing presence of native peoples signifies an incompleteness of the settler project, which responds with anti-indigenous violence. Violent interactions with the police are common, along with enforcement of laws restricting native peoples' movements and behavior that proliferate the border towns arose across the West. In many cities, laws prohibit indigenous people from living within city limits unless they were servants to wealthy whites who agreed to house them in their property, out of sight. While those laws have since been repealed or evolved into anti-vagrancy laws that criminalize houselessness, panhandling, and even resting in public border towns, have a long history of violent anti-indigenous sentiments. A common form of violence inflicted upon indigenous people is, quote, indigenous rolling, or the targeted assault, torture, and murder of native people. The term was first used in 1974 to describe a gang of white teenagers' murder of 3 unsheltered Dene men in the border town of Farmington, New Mexico. The history of anti-indigenous violence is, of course, much older than this. Hold on a second. I'm reading a book, Randy. In addition, the state violence is much older than this. Where is it at? Okay, good. In addition to the state violence enacted by the U.S. military during the Indigenous Wars, private settlers, militias, and companies engaged in decades of unilateral violence against indigenous people. State and federal governments paid these settlers for their service in volunteer militias that hunted, killed, and captured throughout the West states. They collected bounties for scalps and body parts, and often took it upon themselves to organize and arm these militias to wage genocides against native people. Its anti-indigenous violence has evolved over the centuries into forms of border towns violence we face today. For example, quote, indigenous people throughout the West states. They collected bounties for scalps and body parts, and often took it upon themselves to organize and arm these militias to wage genocides against native people. Its anti-indigenous violence has evolved over the centuries into forms of border towns violence we face today. For example, quote, indigenous rolling, end quote, is an ongoing issue in border towns where mostly white Hispanic teenagers and men target native people because of these deep underlying logics of anti-indigenism. They say it with the I word. In 2014, 3 Hispanic teenagers attacked 3 Dene men in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and bludgeoned 2 of them to death, while one narrowly escaped. The 3 teenagers expressed no remorse and were described by the media as unmotivated by racial hate. Yet, as we have seen, they were practicing a long American tradition of anti-indigenous violence. Hold on. This violence also takes on a peculiar gendered form of border towns, especially in areas where resource extraction occurs. Indigenous women, non-men, and trans and non-binary people experience high rates of violence, more than any other race afflicted by white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. The MMIWG2S, which will be described more thoroughly in Part 2, Healing Our Bodies, is rarely framed as a form of border town violence, and both are described as recent phenomena. Gendered violence of anti-indigenous violence have long upheld the colonial projects of resource exploitation, relocation, displacement, and genocide since the first military outposts and forts were constructed along the western frontier, quote unquote, of the fledgling United States. Native women and girls were lured, sold, and kidnapped to the sex trafficking, trafficked to soldiers and traders who manned these outposts and forts. And the same happens today in settler cities. Border towns are the original, quote, man camps, end quote, where men who worked in extractive industries leave while on the job in oil and gas logging and mining. One of the first lines of struggle to end border town violence is the MMIWG2S campaign. Another front line against border town violence that needs urgent attention is unsheltered Native population who face a large proportion of settler violence, both state and private, yet rarely receive justice when they are targeted by police, indigenous rollers, white supremacists, and white business owners. Unsheltered indigenous people are criminalized for merely existing and are constantly forced to move from place to place to avoid arrest and harassment. White business owners respond violently to unsheltered Native people because of their disruption to the capitalist economy and to the image of border towns as tourist traps selling Native culture items as commodities capable of defending themselves from settler violence and to directly advocate for their safety and well-being. Tent cities, which are autonomous communities of unsheltered people with communal services and their own forms of governance, have been successful in providing unsheltered people with safety and numbers, access to food, medical attention, and supplies, as well as a sense of community rather than social isolation. We can call on everyone to defend tent cities from the frequent police raids and sweeps that have destroyed tent cities across the country. We also believe that the formation of tent cities should be politicized. Against settler colonial violence, creating spaces explicitly open to unsheltered Native people who have been displaced from their homelands. We must ensure our unsheltered relatives are involved in the organizing we do communities through industrial waste, but have not been held accountable by the state. People have organized to express their own verdict in corporations that harm them and declare what action will be necessary to remedy these harms. While normally symbolic and educational in nature, the People's Tribunal can carry out investigations into police and vigilante violence, discrimination, and exploitation that occurs in the community. Hear testimonies from witnesses and victims, and present recommendations to local governments for changes that the people identify as necessary. They are public gatherings that can develop in our communities a sense of control over our own safety, especially in hostile border towns, intent on erasing Native people. All right, let's go. Let's see. Area 3, abolishing incarceration, jails, and border security. Incarceration is not an indigenous practice. The idea of knocking people up as punishment was brought to Turtle Island with the European settlers who colonized it. In Europe, they had established debtor prisons to punish those who could not survive within the emerging capitalist economy, or to persecute religious minorities, and in dungeons. In America, prisons and incarceration have historical ties to racialized slavery, chattel slavery, owning people as property, required extreme forms of violence, fear, and discipline to maintain. African and indigenous people who were enslaved to work on plantation resisted in many ways, including escape. Settlers formed slave patrols and militias to hunt indigenous people that later evolved into the current situation of police and military we face today. Prisons and jails in particular have a deep connection of racialized slavery. Even after it has abolished, former plantations were converted into prison work camps where black people arrested for any number of minor crimes, quote unquote, laid out the racist laws, were forced back into slave labor. The 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery except as punishment for a crime, actually expanded the valuable forced labor to include poor people, even if they were non-black. Prisons and jails today serve to remove people from our communities, break up families, disrupting kinship, while either forcing them to work for or labeling them unemployable if they are charged with felonies. Incarcerations in the United States has proliferated over the past decades to levels unseen anywhere in the world. In fact, while it has only 5% of the world's population, it holds 20% of the world's prisoners. There are over 2 million people who have been incarcerated in their lifetimes, and when we include people on parole, probation, in jails and prisons, 1 in every 35 people, 7 million total, in the US are currently under state surveillance or direct control. Over 90,000 youth under the age of 18 are incarcerated in either juvenile detention centers or, if tried as an adult, in adult facilities. This mass incarceration is, of course, racialized with indigenous people locked up at rates much higher than their proportion of the U.S. population. Incarceration has had direct effects on millions in our communities as well as their families, which often take on the financial burden of supporting their incarcerated family members. Mass incarceration involves mass amounts of money in tax dollars spent with the average of $1,048,000 spent per person incarcerated per year. In the cost paid by inmates who must purchase their own soap, clothes, and other necessary items, as well as by families of inmates who have to travel to remote locations for visiting or paying for phone and video chat calls. The interconnected system of laws, prisons, corporations, the use of cheap labor, for inmates and all of the other institutions profiting from incarceration is what is known as the Prison Industrial Complex, PIC. The Prison Industrial Complex extracts profit from the suffering and bondage of our communities while distributing our social relations. More recently, we have seen the prison industrial complex expand to lock up migrants with the creation of ICE and CBP in 2003. Under bipartisan federal administrations, immigrant detentions and deportation has risen in response to the growing migrations of peoples fleeing neoliberal economic policies and violence of Latin America. Cities and county jails have turned into incarcerating detained immigrants caught on the border or within the country. A new migrant detention center have been built by the federal government in collaboration with private prisons, companies, and even religious institutions like Baptist Children and Family Services, which operates multiple migrant detention centers in Texas. Trump's family separation policy, initiated in 2017, made it so that all migrant children crossing the border, including those seeking asylum, would be taken from their families and placed in youth detention centers. It is important to point attention to the vulnerable population that are targeted and impacted by incarceration. For example, BTQ2 plus people are disproportionately criminalized and incarcerated and are often mistreated once inside jails that are organized around strict gender binaries. Many who are incarcerated and excluded from employment are forced into the streets, where they are at even greater risk of police violence and harassment, as well as gender and sexual violence. Single mothers and parents of color are also especially vulnerable, as incarceration typically leads to the loss of employment and very often can result in losing custody of their children while they are incarcerated. We must pay particular attention to the ways that incarceration disrupts our communities' ability to survive, maintain kinship, and live dignified lives. Let me see here. Hold on a second. 58. All right, cool. We're doing good. Within the current dominance of incarceration as the, quote, solution to settler societies, problems, many social services, including mental health and drug rehabilitations, are administered through incarceral institutions. We must begin to create viable alternatives to incarceration that addresses the needs of our communities. We cannot rely on police who murder us or prisons that dehumanize us to provide the services we need. Domestic violence support, as well as shelters for Indigenous women, LGBTQ plus people, and unsheltered people, are areas where we need to build networks of support outside the carceral state, because we do not believe that the systems created for our enslavement, brutalization, and oppression can be reformed. We invite you to join the struggle for abolition of prisons, jails, juvenile detention centers, and border security agencies and facilities. While calls for abolition have recently increased due to the uprising against police brutality, abolition has a long history, especially among Black people who resisted enslavement and have led the movement of abolition to abolish incarceration. We look to the work of the 20th century prison abolitionists, as well as those who carry on the work today. We urge you to join or support the work of organizations like Insight, Critical Resistance, and the movement of Black Lives, and many other working explicitly towards prison abolitionists. All right, we got 10 minutes. See how far. Hold on, let me look at this. 58. 58. Yeah, I'll read one more section and then we'll call it. So one more section. Area 4. Ending occupation everywhere. The United States owns the deadliest and the most funded military power in the world. It invests more in its military than the next 7 largest military powers, more international military bases than any other country. Why does the United States invest so heavily in its military? The answer can be found in the creation of U.S. settler sovereignty, forged through wars against indigenous nations. In its earlier years of existence, the United States needed free land to repay war debts following its war of independence with Great Britain. Looking westward from its original settler colonies to find this land, it created the first federal administration of Indigenous Affairs Office within the Department of War in 1989, to negotiate treaties with indigenous peoples to take land in, quote, fair trade, end quote. However, when indigenous peoples refused to sell their land, George Washington and the United States were ready to wage war, or in Washington's word, to extirpate, end quote, indigenous people. These efforts failed largely because indigenous nations were more powerful than the 13 states at the time. The fledgling U.S. government awaited until another opportunity arose some 30 years later to attack these nations and gain control of their lands. This time it was through legalized theft. The most belligerent of these laws, the Marshall Trilogy, 1823 to 1832, unilaterally changed the status of native nations from foreign nations, their status according to treaties, to colonized subjects of the United States between 1823 to 1832. The U.S. Supreme Court's first Chief Justice, John Marshall, as the geographer Andrew Curley states, quote, defined the status and rights of indigenous nations within the United States as, quote, tribes, as they say it, uncivilized peoples dependent on it and subject to its complete authority. Ew. Drawing from the doctrine of discovery to justify the domestication of indigenous nations, the Marshall Trilogy fabricated laws to alienate Aboriginal titles and strip indigenous nations from their independence. The Marshall Trilogy demonstrated how the foreign status of indigenous nations posed to the existential as well as the material threat of the United States, which had already proven its intentions for vast territorial, political, and economic expansions. As the original foreign nations in the way of U.S. expansion, indigenous nations thus had to be terminated by any means necessary. Legalized theft was used alongside treaties and military campaigns, which include starvations, imprisonment, massacres, and scorched earth policies to force termination. Its assault on indigenous nations shaped the United States' first decades of existence, not only given birth to what we now know as the United States, but also defining its very existence. Although not thought of as such, the colonization of indigenous people by the United States was and continues to be a project of imperialist invasion. This proves that the United States is a white settler colonial nation that does intra-imperialism. In her 2007 book, they use the I word, Indigenous, Old Wars, Dakota scholar, and that's why I said they used the I word, Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cook Lean defines U.S. treatment of indigenous nations as quintessential form of imperialism. Quote, a national policy of territorial acquisition through the establishment of economic and political domination of other nations. End quote. She notes that wars today are driven by the same colonial aggressions and imperialistic nation building as the wars of old. Quote, if there is one policy behind the scenes that link the Iraq experience of the 20th century to the Lakota Sioux experience of the 19th, she writes, it is the policy of imperialist dominance, trampling on the sovereignty of other nations for most of its several centuries of nationhood has been the legacy of the American Republic's power. The original imperial violence enacted by the United States through indigenous genocide and colonization in the North American continues to this day, all in the name of natural resources. They're now giving reserves like federal land to the highest bidder. Now, resources. Hold on, I'm gonna make sure this is not a Khadija. There you go. Resources in territorial positioning and profit. Looking at Standing Rock in 2016, when indigenous people defended their treaties lands against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, were brutalized by National Guard, which was sent in to detain and assault water protectors and land defenders. Salam alaikum, Khadija. Look at Hawaii and Manu Kai, which is Mauna space Kea, where Kanaka, Manoli, Hawaiian indigenous people continually face violence from the U.S. military, along with being arrested by police for protecting their sacred sites. Look at Venezuela, which is under sanctions for refusing to cave to U.S. bullying for oil. Look at Palestine, surrounded by two of the largest U.S. military aid recipients, Israel and Egypt. Look at Okinawa, where in early 2019, tens of thousands of Japanese citizens called for the closure of U.S. military bases. Look at Guam. Look at Vietnam. Look at Bolivia. Look at the Philippines. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. The indigenous wars never ended. The United States simply fabricated new terrorist, insurgents and enemies to justify endless wars of endless expansions. In order for humanity to live free from this violence, we must center the decolonization of indigenous nations and dismantle all laws, bombs, guns, sanctions, banks, corporations, social customs, and agreements across the globe that perpetuate U.S. imperialism. Only then can we truly achieve liberation and justice for indigenous nations in Turtle Island and for all oppressed nations across the world living under the boot of U.S. domination. This means that advocates for indigenous decolonization in global north must have strong analysis and an uncompromising stance on U.S. imperialism. Our struggles for sovereignty and self-determination are the oldest anti-imperialist struggle against the United States. We owe it to our kin in the global south to remember that our struggle for liberation is the same struggle they face. We must unite against our common enemy. We have much to learn from one another. Our indigenous relatives and comrades who gather in the spring of 2010 in Cochabamba, Bolivia, to draft a revolutionary climate document, the People's Agreement reminds us that U.S. imperialism does not happen only through laws and warfare. Imperialism wreaks havoc on the world through capitalism. It keeps resources in the hands of a few while the rest of humanity starves, while the rest of humanity starves and the earth dies. Drawing upon eco-feminists, eco-socialists, and indigenous principles and knowledge of as tools to combat climate change. The People's Agreement is a pact from the global south and social movement that centers the need of majority of the planet, calling for the end of capitalism rather than maintaining the case for enforcing climate debt, and names the special responsibility that the United States, among all other developed countries, has for paying this debt and other reparations for its imperialist violence, ending the occupation everywhere. Thus means centering an effective and principled approach to climate change, thereby releasing the burden from indigenous nations and placing the responsibility where it belongs. To this end, we urge people in the United States to organize campaigns that enforce the following demands for developed countries listed in the People's Agreement. Bullet 1. Restore to developing countries the atmospheric space that is occupied by greenhouse gas emissions. This implies the decolonization of the atmosphere through the reduction and the absorption of their emissions. Next bullet point. Assume the cost of technology transfer needs to developing countries arising from the loss of development opportunities due to the living in a restrictive atmospheric space. Next bullet point. Assume responsibility for the hundreds of millions of people that will be forced to migrate due to climate change caused by these countries, and eliminate restrictive migration policies, offering migrants a decent life with human rights guaranteed in their countries. Next bullet point. Commit a new annual funding of at least 6% of the GDP to tackle climate change in developing countries. This funding should be administered free from conditions and should not interfere with the national sovereignty or self-determination of the affected communities and groups. That's the end of the bullet points. Organizing to implement these demands can also be viewed as a form of divestment and reinvestment. As the People's Agreement notes, an annual funding pool to repay climate debts that is compromised of 5% of the US GDP is, quote, viable, considering that the similar amount is spent on national defense and have 5 times more has been put forth to rescue failing banks and speculators. There you go. What if we create a system where the funds spent on imperialism is the form of defense and bank bailouts were redirected to heal the earth by decolonizing the atmosphere and building the dignified future of our relatives in the global south? This is not simply a question to ponder. It is a life or death program we must take seriously. The United States is holding the rest of the world hostage, denying dignity to billions of people, and literally killing the earth. Not to mention, the US imperialism makes it impossible for other nations to practice basic self-determination or make any meaningful gains when it comes to climate change without constant interference and aggression from the United States, with usurps and thwarts any efforts to perceives to be against its own selfish interest. Only until we embrace anti-imperialism as the heart of our movement, our indigenous liberation will liberation will we be able to call ourselves true relatives, good relatives, to our kin in the global south. We should start by organizing campaigns and movements to implement the People's Agreement. And then next will be Area 5, abolishing imperial borders. A little over, not bad. Add a bookmark. Was there a bookmark? Win. Yep, win. Dang, I read a lot. That's pretty good. I like it. Like, people that are like in the military probably won't like that part, but it's an easy, simple solving. We can solve it, but we decide not to. Instead, we want to continue this white settler colonial nation and keep it going, you know, instead of doing the right things. And they're right. Like, looking at our governments now, nothing's going to happen. The Democrats and Republicans do not want any of this to happen. So why should we look onto our governments? We should create, and again, they talked about creating dual power outside of the system of capitalism and producing these dual powers and dual structures to help people survive, to help survive while we do the movement and abolishing capitalism and imperialism, you know, and abolishing the institutions that destitute the climate and stuff. I wonder if they're in contact with like Maoist groups. That'd be freaking amazing. So, but yeah, see what we got left. How much more do we got left? 143. Hello.
Hello. You know my question. What are your thoughts so far?
Good. I like it how it draws the distinction from from like here and then globally. And I like how it talks about where the imperialism is happening through the borders and stuff like that, and stealing of land and stuff like that. And I like how they also adopt kind of the same kind of concept that like the Black Panther Party did in developing these programs to help people survive through this, and to develop like structures outside of the system to maybe even move into the system that they destroy and replace.
It might not be super written like long, but it does cover a lot of bases.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's the way that it's presented and how it's presented and how it's it's still detailed. You know what I mean? Because it's a manifesto in a sense, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, you could call it a manifesto. I'd call it more of a manifesto, but sure.
It's a call to action. You know what I mean? Very much so, call to action. And all these books should be a call to action. It should drive you to want to do action, to want to do and create these things, to want to go work. It should drive me to go and say, where the places I live into, like in the group I'm in, but I'm going to do more investigation to go out and find out what it means for the indigenous societies here to gain land back and what they might be doing in congruence with these things. So it should drive us as YT people to go out and seek these connections, because I loved it. They don't say no white people. They say no, we need poor white people. So like, it's called to action with them to also do coalitions with them. You know what I mean?
Correct. It's not about exclusion. It's about making sure we get everybody brought together.
Yes. So like, very, 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 this is a good book. You know, I just when they mention AOC, I'm like, no, but now I see what they're going, so it's better, because they do say the Democrats and Republicans are not gonna bring in these divestments, or not gonna they're not gonna self-destroy themselves. You know what I mean?
That's why I said you have to make sure you read all of it.
Yeah,
because they lean on the AOC part at first, but then they flip the script, because what it's doing is bringing the reader in that may be thinking, oh, well, I fall more towards the Democratic side, so
yeah,
what's this case? And then it uses the eye-opening that, listen, no matter if it's AOC or not, it's not going to change this system.
And I like how it draws even in material, we call it historical materialism. It draws the historical natures of the U.S. with congruence in the relations with indigenous people. And I like also how it does tie in intersectionality with black people too. Like it just doesn't mention just indigenous, it mentions the intersectionality of non-white people too.
It also did the LGBTQIA plus community.
Exactly. And the transgender and the trans issues too. So it's good. I think if we have MLs in here, read this book. Read it. It's only 64 pages long, but very important. Read. So yeah, if you're an ML or Marxist or any type, read this book.
I told you, like, a lot of people like.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say a lot of people throw it to the side because they're like, "Oh, this is just an indigenous writing. It has nothing to do with that." And I'm like, "No, it actually does."
No, it does, and depending. But yeah. What's up, chicken strips? Are you there? Am I here?
Sorry, it cut out for me. What was that?
Oh yeah. I just wanted to see what you wanted. What's up?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I was listening and I wanted to bring up the fact because I didn't know if Two Spirit mentioned to you the other day. We heard something that DT is trying to do, and it also has to do like with what was discussed in this book.
Go ahead if you want to. We can always bring it up again.
Yes. So apparently, because I was hearing residential schools being brought up and ICWA, and I know, I'm sorry, brain fart. I know that it was mentioned that ICWA is again now still in place, but they're still like continuously fighting to get rid of it again is the problem. But we heard this morning, apparently DT is trying to start up residential schools again.
Yes, he's moving us back into the scenario of like segregation, Jim Crow laws, residential schools, making it more of a white settler colonial nation, giving more white people more power, but at the same time, like it still strips even like it. The thing is what he sets up demonstrably is going to impact non-white people in a major way with along its wake poor white people, just along its wake, even though that's mainly targeted at non-white people. You know what I mean? So there's gonna be people like white people that fall through the cracks, the cracks, you know. But will it be enough? You know what I mean? I hope.
Right, and I'm not saying, of course, like, we know, you know that we told you, like, there are still residential schools open. The thing is, they just aren't government funded. But with what he's trying to do, once again, they'll be government funded. And the scary thing is that more and more of us are going to be, once again, try to be forced into those.
Well, just to clarify, his statement was he's not just going after children. He's going to force all indigenous people.
Yeah, he wants to put everyone in them. But, like, again, like, it's not like this isn't happening, because what is frozen water doing to indigenous people in the South? Like, it's just another type.
Yeah. But no, yeah, and the thing is like, again, this, like, any kind of book that draws a distinction in this kind of stuff should drive people to actions, you know? Should drive us to, because the conditions are being sharpened, like, ever being sharpened, and increased sharpness of the contradictions of people. It's either we unalive or we fight. For some, it's been there already. For us white people, it's sad, but it's now happening. You know what I mean? In a smaller degree, you know?
Well, and that's why I always suggest people read this book, because it actually brings in that understanding to where it's not just for indigenous people, it's not just for people of the black community, it's for, like, all people to understand that the system is literally trying to oppress every single person in it.
Yeah.
But I am right on that, right? Two Spirit ICWA is in place, but the issue is they're still trying to continuously get rid of it, so it's always on the verge of going away.
Yeah, ICWA. Yeah.
Yeah.
And ICWA protects indigenous families and children, right?
It's
Yep.
it's for adoption situations. So it makes it to where a person that's indigenous cannot automatically just be put with a YT family. It makes it to where they have to ask the relatives first, where originally they would just scoop away the child and not ask the relatives. So this way they don't strip away the culture away from them.
Because when that's the point, when they put us into YT families, then we lose the culture, the connection. We don't know where we come from. Yeah, but Indigenous Child Welfare Act is what it is.
The alienation and the stripping away from your own culture to know who you identify as, and then when you're placed amongst all white people, we're not really able to assimilate into, and then you find out that you were this, and then you feel betrayed and you feel more. Yeah, it's the whole process, isn't it?
And that's what happens to reconnecting people.
It's just the whole trying to erase us. It's this concept of if they can. This is just one other tool they use to try and erase us, is adoption. Another tool they use is residential schools. Another tool they use is just straight up unaliving us. Another one is what they call "quote unquote" forced breeding us out. So like they'll do many of these different things. Forced sterilizations. I could go down the list. I mean, this list will be all day. But the point here is they have many different tactics.
Yeah. And the border towns too. Like I didn't realize that
Yep.
a lot of indigenous people live in the border areas because of migrants and being able to migrate between those
People
things
are on the
because of
border.
traditions and stuff.
My people are on the border. The Haudenosaunee are on the United States-Canadian border, remember?
Yeah. Now I understand the imperialism, like border imperialism and shit too. Like it really displaces indigenous people from their.
That was the whole point of the borders in the first place. The whole point of the borders was purposely to displace indigenous people that they couldn't forcefully displace off their land.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why I can't help but like snicker a little when people tell you to go to Canada Two Spirit. You're like, okay, let me walk over there real quick. I don't get treated any different. Like,
Right? If anything, honestly, I get treated worse in Canada, but that's might change here real soon. But I'm just saying, like, as of it stands at the moment.
right. So you did find, because I still didn't get sent the article or what was said exactly about what he's trying to do. Did you find it then? Because you said.
I'll just ask Neptune.
Well,
Neptune has
I
it.
did. They said they were looking for it for me. They didn't send it though.
Well, I'll ask him.
Okay,
They
they did.
usually do.
They did say that they were sending all Indigenous people, not just children.
Yeah, they said all.
Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. So white people, when is it gonna be time for you to like rise up and actually fucking see shit that doesn't affect you all that much? When is it gonna be time where you look at our brothers and sisters that are not white and be like, that's fucked up, we need to do something about this? When are white people gonna fucking wake the fuck up?
Who wrote that poem in World War II?
Civil
First
War.
they came for the communists, then they came for the next people, and then so on and so forth, and then they came for the Jewish people, and so on and so forth. Who wrote that again? I can't remember.
Yeah, that's exactly. And then they came from like they also don't mention disabled people and people of the LGBTQIA because one of the
Correct.
biggest things that they did burn in Germany was this huge institution that had a whole bunch of gender and sexuality studies. I think something like that. They were like one of the advanced research centers in the world. And
Yeah, you know why, don't you? You know why, don't you?
Tell me.
Because Eastern Germany was communist.
Yes.
That's the reason why. They had farther advancements in science and technology, and Hitler didn't like that.
Yep. Rosa Luxemburg was a social democrat, but came to be a Marxist. Was unallied when the Nat Sox were trying to take over. She was unallied by the own party, the social democrats who chose fucking Schmittler and chose the freaking National Socialist Party. You know, really fucked that up. So.
That's because all it takes is one person with a very good, convincing rate, and they can end up unaliving millions. So
Yeah. All right. Do we have anything else to say before I drop it? I'm gonna go feed Rufus here soon. Is there anything else before I end it?
no, I mean, Chicky, do you have anything? You were listening to the book. I've already read it.
Yeah. No, I'm good. Yeah, but again, I find it real interesting timing that he decided to mention bring the schools back literally on Orange Shirt Day. I find that very interesting.
Yeah. He seems to be precedent when it comes to those things. Like he ends up going to do a speech during a certain time and a certain place that is just based in white supremacy. You know?
It doesn't shock me because it didn't put YT people to the front, and that means that he had to target it. That's why.
Yeah. Sometimes when you ask questions, I might not be able to answer it. But then later on, as I process it more, I'll be like, oh, I know the answer now.
It is a really good book, though. I'm enjoying listening to you read it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Hope everybody else is enjoying it too. I think it's very important that we all check this book out and read it, you know, see what they have to say, because it's important, because it's part of the liberation process of liberating Turtle Island, you know, plain and simple. Okay, well, did you want to say
All right,
something?
well, tell Rufus I said hello. Give Rufus all the loves. With
I
that
will.
being said, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. I'm going to go feed Rufus now. Hello.
I need to get some coins real quick, so if I disconnect, I'll be right back.
Okay. Not a lot of people here today.
Yeah. But if Aziz comes in, I've got coins for them.
Mhm. The book reading, not a time for discussion yet. Yeah, but I don't know if there's going to be this amount of people today. Who knows? No. Maybe, we'll see. Hello.
They're supposed to say hi, not go.
Oh. Alright, we're going to start on the section it calls It's Not Just an Indigenous Problem. Going over probably the non-Indigenous people in this same struggle. So let's do this. Alright, let's get started. Alright, here we go. Not just an Indigenous problem. While Indigenous people are framed as the old age, quote, Indigenous problem, decolonization and land back aren't just an Indigenous problem. If every struggle were made into a climate struggle, which must be done if we are to have a future on this planet, then every struggle in North America must be made into a struggle up for decolonization and force. Indigenous people should be empowered to develop and implement restorative practices according to their own customs and traditions. Caretakers should not hesitate to take the reins of leadership. The energies and passions of Indigenous people at the forefront of resistant extractive capitalism should inspire everyone, as water protectors and land defenders have inspired a generation of climate justice revolutionaries. Indigenous demands for the restoration of land, air, and water are essential for return of the collective humanity. This is a vision and a mandate of the Red Deal, uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in a common struggle to save the earth. Indigenous political structures and economic systems do not apply only to Indigenous people. Our liberation is bound to the liberation of all humans on and the planet. What we seek is a world premised on Indigenous values of introspecies, responsibility, and balance. We seek to uplift technologies, governance structures, and economic strategies that will make this value possible in the immediate future and in the long term, and which always have the future health of the land that at the center of their design and implementations, Indigenous or not. In this sense, decolonization is for the benefit and benefits everyone. It also needs our collective cooperation to succeed. The 4 principles. The following is a plan of collective climate actions based on the principles that we developed after intensive conversations, dialogue, and feedback from Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members, comrades, relatives, and fellow travelers. The first Red Deal Coalition meeting was held on June 19th, 2019 at Larry Cause Freedom Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Since then, the platform has been revised and adopted by social movements, politicians, and organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America. This book is an extension of these original principles and a reflection on the changing material conditions we confront and how these conditions shape and inspire the vision we set forth in the original document. The Red Deal is a living document in the sense that it should not be taken as gospel, nor as an idealistic or utopian program for change.
As conditions shift, so must we. We must be both optimistic and action-oriented, permanent builders. A great deal has changed since we came together in the spring of 2019 to begin our initial discussions about what would later become the Red Deal. The ideas, principles, and plans of action contained within this book have therefore been forged through movement, struggle, and direct action. Some of them have already been tested and revised, awaiting new tests and new potential revisions by those who are moved to take it up within their own struggles and movements. While there is an inherent flexibility built into the Red Deal, we remain steadfast in the following 4 methods and principles of organizing that anchor the original pamphlet. We encourage you to act upon what you find in the Red Deal by applying these principles to your local, tribal, or regional situation. Number 1, what creates crisis cannot solve it. Divestment was a popular strategy during the No DAPL, N-O-D-A-P-L, uprising in 2016. Water protectors called upon the masses to divest from the financial institutions subsidizing the pipeline. The Red Deal continues this call for divestment from fossil fuel industries. But we go one step further. We draw from Black abolitionist traditions to call for divestment from carceral institutions like police, prisons, the military, and border imperialism, in addition to divest from fossil fuels. Divestment is only half of the equation. What will we do with the resources that will become available once we divest from these institutions and practices? As of 2015, military spending accounted for upwards of 54% of all discretionary spending at the federal level. Proposed discretionary spending for national security in 2020 comes in at $750 billion, with $718.3 billion slated specifically for the U.S. military. In a given year, the U.S. provides $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel. 180, a lot more than that recently. $182 billion is spent each year on cops and prisons. These figures don't even include revenues from the fossil fuel industry. Compare this to the $68 billion allocated for education in 2016 and the $186 billion allocated for mental health services in 2014. $66 billion of discretionary funding is spent on healthcare each year, with only $5.4 billion allocated to Indigenous Health Service, IHS, the branch of the Department of Health and Human Services responsible for providing direct medical and public health services to members of federally recognized tribes.
Despite treaty and federal obligations to provide adequate health care, Native people, especially those living in urban locations, have the worst health care in the nation. Almost half of Americans cannot afford basic procedures, and pharmaceutical corporations control these already deficient public services through lobbying. The U.S. government is threatening to further cut spendings on education, healthcare, food stamps, and other critical health and human services in order to inflate military spending, bail out banks, and subsidize fossil fuel corporations. Meanwhile, schools, nursing homes, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, soup kitchens, art programs, museums, clinics, public bus lines, community farms, and local businesses are having to raise money through GoFundMe campaigns and bake sales to remain in operation. Imagine if the U.S. military had to hold a bake sale to keep its doors open while life-giving and sustaining programs were fully funded and never in fear of disappearing. Imagine if we had over $1 trillion to invest in healthcare for everyone, to increase teachers' wages so they can provide quality, free education to everyone, to repair roads and provide safe and accessible public transportation for workers, to provide safe and comfortable homes for elders, and to fund large-scale language revitalization programs in every indigenous nation in the continent, while ludicrous under our current system. Imagine the world we can build through divestment. With the resources we gain from divesting from the U.S. military alone, we could end child hunger, houselessness, and fund renewable energy on a global scale tomorrow. Literally, there is not, as the ruling class wants us to believe, a scarcity of resources. There are plenty of resources to fund these programs. and restore dignity to our relatives. We must simply wrest them from the greedy clutches of the ruling class and distribute them to the people.
And education in the GND, choosing to focus on reforms limited to climate change only. It is important to remember that the GND was possible only because its main proponent, AOC, became politicized by the No DAPL uprising. Indigenous people are and have always been at the forefront of the struggle for climate justice. We will not back down from the GND's demands for a dignified life, nor will we back down from centering the leadership of Indigenous people in this fight. In fact, we must go further. We must throw the full weight of people power behind these demands for a dignified life. People power is the organized force of the masses, a movement to reclaim our humanity and rightful relations with the earth. People power will not only topple empire, but it will build a new world from the ashes, a world where many worlds fit. There can be no rich people without poor people. The rich depend upon the poor. But the poor don't need the rich. We only need each other. This is the power of the masses. Although Indigenous people live in a capitalist society, we continue to practice people power. Pueblo communities feed friends and relatives on many ceremonial occasions throughout the year. The original purpose of this was to prize surplus from those who held more wealth and redistribute it amongst those who didn't, so that neither a poor class nor a ruling class could form. Everyone's material needs were met. There was no starvation, no homelessness, no alienation. Everyone was a relative, and everyone had relatives. Capitalism destroyed this world. We must destroy capitalism to bring it back. People power is the most direct form of democracy. Every day, people decide what's best for themselves, not the elite and powerful. The wealthiest in the world have refused to pay taxes for more than a century, while Indigenous people starve and die of preventable diseases. We are of the conviction that crying on the shoulder of the man who stole your land is the opposite of people power. You can't smudge the purposeful unaliving out of capitalism, nor can you expect the powerful to give up their wealth out of the kindness of their hearts.